Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 195 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. My name is Billy Bob. I'm on the West Coast, and I'm with my regular every other Friday special guest, historian, author, and geopolitical analyst, Christine Lynn. Thank you so much for joining me this morning, Christine. I know you're streaming from the mountains of Colorado, and I really appreciate you taking the time. We have a great, timely topic prepared, and our topic today is USA, the world's biggest terrorist. It's just a no-brainer. And like I said, it's very, very timely. I mean, especially with all the terroristic things the United States is up to right now. But when we talk about terrorism, Christine, let's just define the term. Like, what is from your perspective, what is terrorism?
All right. Well, from my perspective, I take a very, let's say, objective and logical, you might even say academic approach to the definition of terrorism. And before I say that, I would say I want everyone to think about the word terrorism and what that does when you hear it. It is very emotionally charged. But it is rarely examined as in the context and in the definition, as you and I are going to do today. But for me, I look at the inconsistency of how it is applied. It is selectively applied. And who does that? It is always the West. We'll just say the United States in terms of the dominant. Generally, most people, if you ask them, most people, even academics, are going to think of terrorism as non-state actors and even civilians for that matter, who are using acts of violence to achieve an end, a goal, to make a society have that fear in order to control them, to bring them to submission. But states are excluded by design. So you never hear the United States described as a terrorist state, and that is because they selectively apply the definition. But to me, the objective, I should say, is the idea of the use of fear, the deliberate use of fear and violence and suffering in order to achieve a political end. And this can apply to individuals, it can apply to groups, and it can most certainly and must apply to nation states, because the standard cannot be upon what is done even, or who is doing it. It has to look at the action. So as such, if you get an objective, logical definition of that use, you can only look at the United States in the world as being the largest terrorist group. I mean, it is endless, the acts, the nature of the act. But again, it is selectively never used. You're never going to hear anyone in the U.S. government or even most Americans think of themselves, their nation, as that. And also, I want to make a distinction. It's not only who is doing it. They exclude the state actors, but you can't do that and be logical. But it is also the idea, to me, terrorism, if you're using fear and violence to subjugate someone, to make them, come to the table and allow your will over a sovereign people's or sovereign nation, then everyone who dies as a result of the violence is a victim. They are actually an innocent victim. And I don't care if they are wearing a military uniform, because if it is an unjust aggression in order to achieve a political end, such as in the United States case, their hegemony, their geopolitical power, the energy dominance, all of this, if it is for any reason aside from actual self-defense, then everybody who dies as a result of their bombs, their missiles, their blockades, the starvation. You look at what is happening in Cuba right now, 11 million people suffering, incubators off, people on life support cannot have that. These are all examples of terrorism, but it is done by a state actor. And the largest state actor, nation state in the world that commits the most terrorism has been the United States. And that's what we're going to discuss. But that is if you use an objective, logical definition. The United States frequently uses this word to shape perception. They will support a terrorist organization, quote terrorist, and one day later, 1 year later, they're their allies. So again, when you see that switch, you see the hypocrisy of it. It's because it is selective in order to keep themselves out of it. And I would say that, any such use of aggression, we have to start using this word and applying it consistently and frequently in regards to the terrorism that we're seeing. We can't refer to it in other ways. So to me, as a historian, I want an objective term. And when you make people suffer, you use the threat of violence or violence itself. When you starve them, when you give them this deprivation for a political end, that is terrorism. Also, my last point is when I say it's not a matter of who it happens to. Someone dies in a uniform, but your country should not have been attacking that country, then that is a death due to the terrorism inflicted upon them. You will frequently in the West hear terrorism applied to, isolated individuals. They don't have a political end. They are not going to affect the society at large because of their disturbance, perhaps emotional, mental disturbance, whatever might be going on with them. But they're using the word terrorism more and more, again, selectively, in order to heighten, I would say, the fear in our own population. And that in itself is a form of terrorism. What would be your comment on it?
No, I would agree, of course, with all of that. And I want to focus on how the term is cynically manipulated and exploited, in furtherance of political ends. And so that's really what the United States does. It'll designate certain countries as state sponsors of terrorism, and that'll allow the United States to, attack them with, terrorism, right? It justifies U.S. terrorism against those countries that they call, sponsors of terrorism or terrorist states. But also you have the censorship, right? So once they label somebody a terrorist in the United States, the media takes their cue, the establishment press takes their cue, and then they talk about that entity, whether it's a state or a group like Hezbollah or Iran, the state of Iran, and they will just take their cue from the State Department's listing them as a state sponsor of terror or a terrorist entity, and then they will report, dutifully that way. And also, and so through that, it's perception management, like you explained. But then there's also censorship. So I know I was kicked off of Facebook for a good while because I posted a Hezbollah flag, in support of a Hezbollah flag. And so that's another way. It's like once the government, uses this label, it really becomes a convenient propaganda tool where the entirety of the press then agrees and treats them like, actual terrorists, while at the same time censoring any alternative opinion. So, it's just an important aspect of how the term terrorism is exploited. So, and the domestic media, consideration is definitely one very important aspect. The censorship of people like you and me against giving our support to these terrorist states, and then the media just brainwashing everybody into believing this nonsense, that just gets repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated until everybody, is on the same page. And if you talk to somebody, hey, they're not a terrorist, like they're defending themselves, people look at you, oh, you're a terrorist sympathizer. What the hell's wrong with you? Everybody knows, like, come on, we all watch the news. We know, we know what these groups are. But yeah, so there's no definition, there's no coherent definition, and I think that's like a double standard, because I think certain agencies have actually defined it. And then when you try and use that definition, it definitely applies to the U.S. And again, that conversation just never takes place. There's no accountability. The media isn't holding them accountable because, they're all on the same page. But so essentially it's a tool to it's a propaganda tool to justify and further Western imperialism and Western terrorism. But so when we talk about terrorism and war, so how do we make a distinction between what is a justifiable use of force, justifiable use of aggression, and something that rational, thoughtful people would characterize as terrorism?
Well,
Like,
yeah, it goes to what you're saying. There is a distinct line between war and terrorism, but that line is ignored by the United States. War is, a targeting of the adversary's military. It's targeting its capacity to fight. It's not going to target the population. It is also going to have a very high regard for human life at all times. And civilians, certainly in war, are going to be harmed and died, but that's not intended. And in terms of something you were just now saying was, I believe that the use of the word war for the Americans, for most Americans, the way that the state uses it, as you were talking about, is indeed to rationalize and justify it, just as you were saying, when they censor anyone who would critique it and say, well, who's the quote bad guy here, really? Who started the aggression? So, in terms of war, always, I mean, we go back through all of history. It is really a matter of who is that initiator, aggressor. Unjustified aggression, if it's not in self-defense against an adversary that is trying to harm you, kill you, steal your resources, then it is unjustified. And by that definition, Billy Bob, I would have to say that the countless military interventions, be it called war or whatever else name that the United States has given to it, has resulted because they were all unjustified. If you push aside World War II, and even that, if you go back, that's an entire different conversation about the U.S. involvement in World War II, but let's put that aside. But frankly, every other intervention, I mean, doesn't matter. All of the coup d'etats that we have had, we can think of Iran, we can think of Guatemala, we can think of all of these things where force was used, civilians died, people died, mass suffering. None of what, in my opinion, from my study, none of the altercations, and there have been countless ones in which tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and when you think about the long-term effects, millions of people who have died and suffered in everything that the U.S. military has been used for. You start to see that is not a blurred line. It shouldn't be a blurred line between war and terrorism, but they have always used that, to use your word, to justify it. I look back at in Vietnam, I look at the My Lai massacre, and some people just want to dismiss that. Oh, the men were under stress, and here they murdered, hundreds of civilians. But it's not isolated. I would also say that if one begins to study it, you will actually find people who defied the orders that were given to them. Especially, I was just listening to a veteran from the Vietnam War who was actually ordered, as he was doing an extrication for American military, to then murder all of the women and children that were around the helicopter as they left. They had just been giving them candy and toys. I forget the man's name, but you can probably find it. A very old man now, of course, sharing how they were told to do that. The reason I mention that is because I don't believe something like the My Lai massacre is an anomaly. I believe that is an example. It was also done in World War II. I mean, you look at the U.S. military, you look at the bombings of Dresden and Hamburg. A lot of people don't think about it. We think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of that civilian death for a political end, even in World War II. And of course, that raises a lot of controversy for people. The Tokyo firebombing, people don't even think about what happened there. But my point is, through all of these military excursions, wars, whatever they would be called, it's always, as you said, justified, rationalized by calling the enemy whatever name they wish to call him, and saying as if this is a righteous war of self-defense. But the fact of the matter is, none of these countries that we're talking about were invading the U.S. border, were coming here were threatening U.S. life. It is the United States that has 800 to 1,000 bases at any given time worldwide. They are the aggressor. So I would just have to say that when you're bombing cities unnecessarily, when you're using blockades and sanctions, as they frequently do, it is a pattern of the United States, and they will simply use that word war or other justifications to call other people terrorists in order to justify it. It makes American people think of the enemy, and I use that in quote marks, the enemy population as being expendable. And that all goes back to American exceptionalism. And Americans, most Americans, are very prone, that makes them feel very good, their country right or wrong. But any violence for a political hegemonic control, that is terrorism. That is not true war. And in war, these acts of terrorism happen, sadly, tragically, often on both sides as well. Not necessarily, but I would just have to say, when you see the deliberate use of violence to make fear among a civilian population in order even to get them to turn against their government, like what you see the United States doing right now in Iran, that is for their own objectives. It is no longer war. War is only when you're targeting a military that was aggressing against you.
That brings us to the big war on terror. Like, is it even possible to have a war on terror? Like, how would you even go about fighting a war on terror? I mean, the whole premise is so illogical and backwards. And yet we sat through it and everybody cheered it on and everybody talked about it like it was a rational thing to do, to have a war on terror. And how did we wage a war on terror? Mostly through drone assassinations of innocent women and children. That's how we waged our war against terrorism.
Well, it's nonsensical. You can't have a war on terror. I mean, it's you have a war against an army. The whole idea of the concept is false. Yet, as we've discussed, it serves their purpose. What does it allow the United States to do? It allows their interventions, it allows their sanctions, and it can be against many different countries then. It's not a war against this country, a war against this country. It was really perfectly designed, I'd have to say, for the purpose of endless war, which is what the United States government, the United States military is used for. There's no endpoint, excuse me. And as you said, it got mass public support. Because everybody, as we began this, as I said, it's an emotionally charged word. Well, who's going to disagree that we got to have a war on terror? But it's nonsensical. You can't have a war on, quote, terror. You only have a war against a group of people that are aggressing against you. So it just was another rationalization that could give them, to simplify something very complex going on in the world, and then they could frame any country they wanted as a target, and the Americans would support them. So again, it's the labels. They're not where and it keeps people from looking at the actions of the United States government, the United States military. It is, again, that perception control. And the U.S. State Department does this in other ways. I think you mentioned earlier, like the state sponsor of terrorism. That is a nothing term that comes from the U.S. State Department. That is as crazy as their rules-based order. It's not recognized internationally. It is simply something that the U.S. State Department uses to justify frequently their sanctions. The same thing with like safe haven. It's simplifying the whole thing so they can frame a country as a target, and then do all of their covert operations and their surveillance, and everybody's going to do that. They will, but they really only use it against all of the non-aligned states, the non-vassal states. all of the countries that simply want to focus upon their own sovereignty. And that's the U.S. terminology. Anytime you hear anything coming from the United States that they have termed, because these are not internationally recognized words, Billy Bob. It is, again, that perception, as you were discussing earlier. So it's just nonsense. And I would advise people to stop using United States terms. There's no reason for any of us to talk about the war on terror. It doesn't exist. Okay, there is no such thing. It's crazy to even talk about. You cannot use their words, because then you're validating it as if there has ever been an instance of legitimacy. But they use it to give legitimacy to illegitimate, internationally illegal violence against other people. Terrorism.
And I wanted to go back to the idea of how it shapes the discourse, in domestically, right? And so what happens first of all is anyone who wants to go against this narrative that Hezbollah is a terrorist, or that Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism, anybody that dissents from that is not allowed in polite discourse. They're not going to be allowed in front of the camera. They're not going to be on any of the platforms of mass communication. They're going to be ostracized. And if they get on social media like Piers Morgan, they just get attacked by the other liberals by saying, you support terror, and it just dumbs down the ability for people to have thoughtful, rational discussions, which of course is the ultimate intent, right? It's the ultimate intent, because if the ruling class isn't interested in people being smart and making themselves aware and talking about things and informing themselves, right? They're interested in pursuing their agenda, pursuing their hegemonic objectives with as little resistance as possible, especially from their domestic population. So the word terrorism really facilitates this, just like you were explaining with the war on terror. Like, it's nonsensical. And like you said, it helped them do so many things without any of the consequences. They could bomb people with impunity. They could steal resources. They could overthrow governments. They could assassinate people, all they want, without any consequences from their domestic public or internationally, because, they were, used 9/11 or whatever to justify it.
Right.
So,
right.
But yeah, very cynical.
Billy Bob, when you used Iran, as an example there, it brought back to mind, when you think about, this is what is on everyone's mind. They should also be thinking about Gaza and Palestine, as well as Russia. Russia is being victimized by endless terrorism from the United States via Ukraine. Frankly, I'd say almost every week now we have multiple instances of civilian residences being targeted. It's very sad. It's tragic. But when you mention Iran, it brings me back. You think about it. All the coups are examples of this as well. Many people die initially, just like in Ukraine with the Maidan. But, in 1953 with Iran, we had the coup d'etat. A lot of people died at the time, but then you see what the Shah of Iran did, and his terroristic regime, frankly, the terrorizing of all of the people. I also think about Iran. I think back in 1988, the United States. How could anyone not call this terrorism? Not only the overthrow of the government, but since the revolution, then they had in 1988, the United States shot down a civilian jet plane filled with almost 300 civilians. And I think it was close to 66, 67, something, children on that plane, and what do? They just shrug and come off with that is Iranian civilians died.
Sure.
You take a look at Manab, the school just recently, where almost 200 elementary girls, and that was U.S. missiles. That was the United States murdering all those children at once. And of course, now we look at all the death in Iran. Every single Iranian death because of U.S. aggression, going back to 53, going through the 80s, and their Iran-Iraq war, and they're choosing their sides, and what they're doing now. Every single Iranian death is an act of terrorism by the United States. And I don't care if it's any of the groups that they want to label. The fact is, those groups are over there. What business does the United States military have even being there? That's not their part of the world. So yeah, I think about Iran. It has been that way for decades. In fact, it was very interesting. I really had forgotten this, but I was even reading somebody discussing Trump and discussing Iran from years ago, where there did seem to be as if there was some very strong anti-Iranian, and wherever that came from, almost like a continuation. And I found that interesting that someone noted a very early interview with him, but I haven't gone back and watched it. But you see this, and that may just be him at the time, long before he was involved in politics, as an American, being subject to that miseducation, that lying propaganda that becomes a part of a person. And then years later, he has this power. But of course, he's a megamaniac with his power as president. But you see, every single person makes a difference. He was not necessarily always that way, but he also succumbed. I am in no way excusing what the evil that that person is doing. But what I'm saying is, he too, very early on, apparently also got into that U.S. lying propaganda. And that's the danger of it. That's the danger of the terminology. It's the danger for anyone to accept any of their terminologies and their classifications of another nation state. If you don't know and you're not involved in it, you should withhold your judgment. But most Americans do not do that, as you said. And also, you touched on something very important earlier, was the persecution of anyone, whether it's personally, or publicly, as we do, that immediately triggers in the American people against anyone saying, you need to question, why are you calling them the enemy? Oh, well, we all know it. We watch it on the news. And that just shows the insidious nature of it. And everybody needs to step back from anything that you think you know. And most especially if it's something that the United States you grew up just knowing. Because I'd have to say, in my life, 60 years now, I look back and I say, everything that I was told and thought early in my life, not too long. I question things a lot, but nevertheless, we all have accepted some of those falsehoods, and it might take years until we question it. You need to question everything if it's just so because you grew up in the United States and it's what you've always been told. It's very dangerous. Whatever power you have, we see what happened with Trump and the power that he now has. Very dangerous man in the world. But again, every single person has whatever power within their reach, and you're either supporting this because just being an American, sadly, this government, our taxation is used for worldwide terrorism. And I don't think Americans should be afraid to use that word, and they need to do it more, not just you and me and people like us. Anyone should be thinking about what is the definition of terrorism. 200 dead little girls in Mainab in Iran, about less than a month ago. That's terrorism. And I don't care, just like I said, when you go back to when they shot the airliner of Iran down in 88, they could say, oh, it was just a mistake. No, I don't care what it was, mistake or not. And I'm not going to accept anything the U.S. government says. I will always question it. I don't know. But it wouldn't have happened if you weren't terrorizing the country to begin with.
Right. They shouldn't have had their, destroyers right off the coast of Iran. I remember George H.W. Bush modeled. He was the leader of the American people at that time, and he modeled what he wanted Americans to do. And he said, I will never apologize for our country. Our country is a force of good. And that's now the motto of the Navy, a global force for good. Mm-hmm. So it's just, we're just steeped in this propaganda. And I wanted to make the other point that we can be patriotic Americans. And like, I think me and you, are the most patriotic Americans because we understand that our country, is controlled of, by, and for a transnational oligarchy that doesn't care about this country or the people in it. They care about themselves. And they're the ones that are starting all these wars, engaging in all this terrorism. And so it is the most patriotic thing to denounce that. and to tell the the transnational oligarchic elite that don't have any loyalty to this country or our people to to you know to 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 get lost. And we need to go again, unite, organize, and put in place a government that actually represents our national interests, the working class. And that just means a whole lot of things, but it's too much to get into. Let's talk about the terror that the United States as a vehicle for a class of oligarchs, right? The kinds of terror that they've done. So in order to create a global empire, they've had to engage in tremendous terrorism. In order to maintain this global empire, they have to continue to engage in tremendous terrorism. And that's why Martin Luther King said, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. That was in the late 60s. That statement is far more true today. So there's a history of terrorism creating this global empire, and then there's this continuity of terrorism right now to maintain this global empire, and we see it going on, really rapidly escalations all around the globe, terrorism everywhere against Russia, against Iran, against Venezuela, against Cuba, like all these sanctions, like it's just nonstop. It's really ramping up, but Native Americans, right? A lot of terrorism, genocide against the Native Americans, conquered this country, women and children. I mean, it was abhorrent. The Philippines, the very first, we got our toes wet into the empire game in the Philippines. And a general, I forget the general's name, I have it here on my phone, like he authorized explicitly the murder of hundreds of thousands of women and children. Like this isn't Mark Twain wrote about this. It was an abomination. Long history of terrorism. Korea, biological warfare against the North Koreans. We terror bombed them. We ensured that there was no building over 2 stories standing. We bombed everything. We dropped biological weapons. Thankfully, we didn't do nuclear weapons, but General MacArthur was really begging the president to just nuke the place. And I think that before Trump leaves office, I'm worried that this nuclear taboo will be crossed, this nuclear red line. But that's a different topic. So Vietnam, we used Agent Orange and napalm, and we just destroyed jungles and the environment just so we could, because we thought that would help us defeat them. So imperialism has no lawful or moral restraints. It pursues its interest without any lawful or moral restraints. It is happy to engage in genocide, in the mass slaughter of women and children, if by doing so, they can achieve their core interests. And that's what demands resistance. Like that's why we have no choice but to speak out and to advocate for progress. Progress is getting rid of imperialism, creating better systems, putting in place a government that's actually representative of the people instead of the transnational oligarchy that benefits and has created this empire through terrorism and maintains it through terrorism. And then they have their mass propaganda apparatus, telling everyone, this isn't terrorism. We're the good guys. They're the bad ones. It's just, come on, people. Are you so dense? Are you so dense? Thank you, Christine, for letting me vent.
Yeah, you said a couple of things there, and you mentioned 9/11 as well.
Yeah.
And that is, I think we should talk about, and that is what I'm going to reference. And I said earlier, sadly, tragically, sometimes both sides, then even the victimized side, can then turn to terrorism out of they don't have the large military, they don't have the same capacity, and so they may rationalize that as well. Also, when you were talking about all of the mass murders that they have done worldwide, it reminds me the people are remembering. It's like when you go to Serbia, the bombing of Yugoslavia, what happened there, the people are still dying, not just all those and the children that died, but because of the munitions used.
Yeah.
And also also, you think about, something you said made me think of how the U.S., what is the other big one? War on terror was always the war against communism. All of those that you stated, Vietnam, Korea, even I would say in the Afghan war, the United States supported the Mujahideen, and now you look at the irony of it. All right, because they were fighting the Soviets. So this is just the tactic that the U.S. uses. But back to 9/11, which I think we should take a look at. I would remind people, first of all, there is always going to be blowback. You cannot go hit a hornet's nest and expect not to be stung. Those hornets didn't come over to the United States. You went over to their countries. And that, again, is no justification. Evil does not justify evil. It may even be intellectually understandable, but that is where everyone has to look at themselves and make sure you are always, even in self-defense, behaving righteously. So, but it does make me remember, and I would urge everybody to read Osama bin Laden. I think he actually called it Letter to the American People at the time, and in it it was relatively short. You can find it if you search online. He said, "Why are we fighting and opposing you?" And he said, "It's simply because you attacked us and you continue to attack us." Again, and he went on to rationalize, or in from his values, justify, even civilian death. And I certainly reject that. Again, an example of the retaliation, but the anger that the United States has caused people. You're going to have to expect blowback. We're going to have to see that now. 9/11 was most certainly terrorism. Terrorism, when it is targeting the people not related. War is when you target the entities, and those precise entities, the governments themselves, the militaries themselves, that are inflicting this violence upon you, but never to resort, as the U.S. has frequently done, and yes, others have done against the U.S., to then attack the civilian people, even if the civilian people are as stupid as most Americans are and waving their flags, supporting something like how Bush rallied them to it. Nevertheless, that is the line that has to be drawn. It isn't always drawn, but the fact is, Americans should look at it. You go around the world doing this, there's going to be, as we call it, consequences, actions for what you are doing. And you have created instability, you have created hatred, you have created generations, the United States has, of people who are going to reject and hate the United States because of all the death. There's not families that have not been touched. People wiped out in their families. You look at what is going on in Gaza. You look at what is going on in Lebanon. This is not going to go away. This is going to be for generations from now, many decades. This is going to be forever, frankly, because they are not going to forget what the United States has done. And some of them may choose their targets wisely, going exactly against the ones that are killing them, which is the U.S. military. Some of them may also step over that line and also use terrorism as a means of defense. Not justified, but nevertheless, the Americans should look at themselves and say, you are the causation of all of this, most of this in the world.
Yeah, and it's a vicious cycle, and we ought to have special and more contempt, for the people that are initiating this cycle and perpetuating it, and the blowback. We got to understand the blowback in context, right? And so the problem is, even when the blowback, even when we understand it in context, it is, when it's used against innocent, Westerners. That kind of benefits the oligarchs, because then they can use it to clamp down on dissent and use the threat. They hype that threat, the threat of terrorism here, and they use it to crack down on dissent, and again, it just justifies more of their overseas aggression. But I mean, it's a human response, right? Like, if you it's hard, it's difficult to just forgive people who destroy your entire family, and the human nature is to just, think, okay, well, I'm going to get revenge.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if once we put that seed in, millions of people's minds, it's going to result in blowback. And then again, but I part of me thinks that that's great from the perspective of the oligarchs, because they live in their gated communities, they have their luxury bunkers, and they're not too concerned about us anyway. They're interested in maintaining their obscene proportion of wealth, power, and privilege. So I didn't quite conclude. Like, I mean, I just mentioned a few.
Oh no,
The
there's
tiniest fraction of U.S. terrorism, and
well,
there's so much more.
yeah, well, toward that, I was going to share this at the end of the show, but toward that, Billy Bob, this week I published a new essay about this topic and what is terrorism really. And at the end of my essay on my website, I have an extensive list of, and it may not be all inclusive, but it was the best that I could do, of the United States, and to me and my logical, objective, consistent definition of terrorism, of all the terrorism the United States has done. All of these, whether they're coup d'etats, whether they're using the use of proxies, whatever that they are in their wars. So that list is on my website, Historian of Truth, and go to the terrorism essay. And I just started thinking about it. And I said it earlier, I could not think of any instance, there may be one, where the U.S. military has been used, and put World War II aside, even though terrorism was used in that, but in any justifiable way. So you can find that list at historianoftruth.com. Also, you made a really great point there about the U.S. then clamping down. They will benefit from whether, and I thought this would be important for us to think about, the false flag atmosphere that we have going on right now. I mean, it is prime for that. And don't think that the United Americans are going to be any exception to terrorism. They not only will exploit anything that is actually used, but they will instill that fear. We've already been seeing it, talking about, I think, in drones or something in California, or I don't know what, in their cells. Not that isn't a possibility, but they're going to be hyping it. And we know that they have a history of false flags in order to get Americans to agree to whatever war that they wish to do. So Americans aren't going to be immune to it, whether it is actual terrorism done by somebody else, or whether it could even be a false flag. Regardless, they are, as you said, going to clamp down on Americans. You look at all of the freedoms that we lost, with their war on terror and George Bush, and even our freedom of speech and communications, and what previously was guaranteed without warrants. And there were those of us who at the time said, look at what they're doing. You can't accept this. But then it became a part of our society, and it is accepted. So I thought that was an excellent point, because they will clamp down on it more, and really focus upon it. In fact, they're not only the biggest terrorist in the world, they like anything that would happen, frankly. And it might sound extreme for people to say, but if indeed a tragedy happened in this country, even if it were some other actor and not a false flag, I think it would be the greatest thing that they would benefit from, and they would take it with glee. You look at someone like a Hegseth and that evil glee that he expresses, and it goes back to what I was saying before, about murdering people. And the word murder should always be used. When it's terrorism, those who die have been murdered. And that's what they're doing in Iran. That's what they're doing worldwide. They're murdering Russians. They don't care about the Ukrainian death. They're murdering all the people, in the Middle East. They're murdering. They're murdering people in Cuba right now. I mean, by that embargo, and people are dying. We should not only use the word terrorism much more often, but we should also use the word murder. Don't clean it up as if there is any justification for what someone like this government and what Hegseth is doing. But again, it goes back to what I said. I think that this is inherent in the United States. and in many Americans, and of course the government manipulates it to encourage this, but that American exceptionalism allows them to do anything. And for Hegseth to stand up there with that big, disgusting, evil grin on his face as he talks about people dying and what they're going to do. And you see Trump doing that as well. We need to use the correct terminology, not their terminology, to get people thinking logically and consistently. And I think we might want to explore this. We talked about blowback. But I would also say, when I talked about false flags and such, I would remind people that's not just in the area of speculation. I mean, the U.S. government has done tremendous experiments in evil against U.S. citizens who did not agree. You think about MK Ultra, but there was even in 1962 Operation Northwoods that was proposed. Never happened. Kennedy shut it down. And, you know, what we were talking about there was terrorism in the United States. Some would be simulated and some would be real, where American citizens would die, be killed, be targeted, let their airplanes be shot down. It was the idea that they would cause terrorism, including death, to American civilians, and then blame it on Cuba in order for them to be able to justify such a war. That's in 1962. That came from the highest in the military, okay? And if you think about it, that was taken seriously as if something they could present for the U.S. to do. If that happened then, even though Kennedy said no to that, what else has been proposed since then? And what else has been implemented? And at this time, may be implemented, because I think it is a part of, sad to say, many American psyche to think that way, because they're not righteous. They don't have a right and wrong. To them, it's right if it will benefit the United States. And that is the way the U.S. military is being used, and don't think we're going to be any exception.
Yeah, I mean, if you understand that the country is kind of governed by a transnational oligarchy, like those are the owners of this country. They own the government, they own the military, and that's how they think, right? So they're not loyal to the people of this country, and they're loyal to their class, and their class is international. And they would happily, blow up some Americans if they thought that was going to get them what they wanted. I think Kennedy knew that it would probably be cause more harm than good. But I thought of the phrase "necessity is the mother of invention" when we started talking about false flags, and I really believe that there is a clamoring among the ruling elites right now for more of a justification for what Trump's trying to do in Iran. Like, I think that there's a lot of pushback. I mean, people are saying we're losing, the war's stupid. And I'm kind of surprised to see that, right? They don't have real good, narrative control, right? Like the media, even the establishment press is kind of, saying some things. I'm surprised, because they usually have much better narrative control. And I think this means that they're really, really hoping, and there's a high demand by the elites for a justification. And that's where I think a false flag could come in. And I mean, we'll know it immediately when we see it. Like when we wake up the next morning and the headlines are all, "Oh, Iran did this, Iran did this." We're going to see that they have pressed the button on their propaganda offensive. But I think they really need that. And I think there could be one coming soon, just because, it's like they got to sell this, and they're not doing a good job of selling it. And so they really need it. And so it could come from anywhere, come from the CIA, from Israel, from Mossad. Like, I mean, and it'll be like JFK, 60 years gone by and no answers. They're still doing the cover up, and that's just how they operate. I think a false flag is very likely in the near future, just to really, help them to sell this World War III, because World War III is what we're facing, and people aren't for it. They're really going to have to engage in some sales to get people on board, and I think they will. I think they're going to make a much stronger effort to sell this to people, and there's going to be some events that go along with it who knows what those could be. Anyway, that's my speculation. You said so many great things, and I had so many thoughts. I want to apologize. I wish I would have known that you wrote your essay. I would have linked directly to your essay, and I would have read it
They'll find
before
it.
we started. But we definitely did link to your website in the description. Everybody can just see historianoftruth.com in the description, and then read that essay on U.S. terrorism.
Point. Also, I would also say that installation of fear in the American people, and the American people really are, most of them, a fearful people. Unlike those who, have the critical thinking and evaluate themselves, withhold judgment. They don't just listen to some news person or someone in government telling them something and they believe it. And yeah, you said they don't have the same narrative control, and that's good, because now more than ever the truth can get out, and it is up to everyone as they learn the truth to be sharing it. But something you said there made me think of also, in addition to the idea of staging an event that has proven throughout history to get Americans to support whatever the U.S. wanted to do, two things would be American deaths. And then there was another point. You when you talk, it makes me think of things. I think that we take a look at the buildup in the Middle East right now, and how many thousands Trump is sending there, and whatever that's going to be about. Whether they're going to, if they try to take Carg Island, sure, they can take it, and it's going to be a lot of bloodshed, a lot of dead Americans coming back in the coffins, so that Trump can stand there and maybe not with his little campaign USA cap on. I think he learned his lesson that first time he did that. But he can stand there and salute the dead bodies of American sons and daughters coming back. And if he does proceed with anything on the ground, considering what we know of how many decades Iran has prepared to protect itself against just such an American invasion, and the terrain itself, they're just going to be sitting there to be killed. He can have his little immediate quote success, but there would be a lot of death if he tries anything on the ground. And obviously the Iranians are not going to be intimidated by this, and they are a most courageous people. When I think about the Iranians, they have long called the United States the Great Satan, and it is. They are correct. And frankly, I believe any true American, like you were saying, any true patriotic American who loves those fundamentals of what they think the United States is about, freedom, liberty, respect for others' sovereignty and their way of life, should actually be seeing that the United States has always been the great Satan in the world. The vast majority of the millions of deaths in this world, whatever it came from, is because of the United States. My other point was about terrorism. I would like to ask people, do you feel safer when you drive into your city and you see a group of ICE agents all congregated over at a store? And do you feel safer when you go on and you see people in your community saying, oh, they're here today? Because the lack of training, you see the out of control. What is the feeling in the U.S. right now? That tension is a fear of terror. It is a terrorizing of the American people. And the end does not justify the means, ever, in any of this that we're talking about. And that's where the whole concept of terrorism, why it's implemented, is that the end does justify the means. But no, that is evil. But I would say right now, people feel less safe, less secure. And it is, instead of looking as you can in some other countries, when you see, those in the authority to, let's say, enact law and to keep the peace, so to speak. But over here, we're becoming to know that so many of them are not properly trained, and they do have that that egotistical feel that you actually start to feel some terror in you. I think I'll just avoid going to that city because it's covered in that today. You don't want to be caught up in it. Well, you shouldn't feel that way in your own country. They're really making a sense here of a sense of terror among American citizens itself. I believe that's going to get worse far worse. What do we got them in our airports for? This nonsense. Directing traffic like they're little children, pointing people to go. I mean, they couldn't help it. They were put there by Trump. But the fact is, it's not reassuring. You don't think safety and security. You're thinking terror. And I think that is also by design. And I think that our entire society is going to become much more that way, again, by design. Because, the greatest threat, both internationally and I would say domestically, is unchecked power without accountability. And we only have a semblance of accountability in the United States. On the international stage, they have no accountability. People are going to force them into it. And that is why I admire what the Iranians are doing. People are going to force them into it, and they're not going to be able to get away with it. But here domestically also, I think that there is less accountability than it should be. And I think that's going to become a lot of tension. And hopefully we'll see what happens in the courts over all of this. But we don't have much accountability. We definitely don't have it internationally. The UN is nothing. They think that might makes right, but it doesn't. And now they're finally seeing that they cannot go around the world behaving that way. But don't think that you're immune as an American, because I think that terror is going to be inflicted upon us in different levels, psychologically as well as actually physically.
Yeah, if we are escalating World War III even more than, even quicker than we have been the past several years. I mean, you could say that Ukraine was the start of World War III. You could say that the planning for the regime change in Ukraine was the start of, you can put the start time anywhere you want, but definitely we are in a global war that the U.S. is prosecuting by design. And as that war ramps up, like we're only at the very beginning stages, as that war ramps up, I mean, the domestic situation is going to change. It's going to be, we're headed on a trajectory that is going to be, it's going to continue and get a lot worse. The thing that you're describing, the tension, the fear. I mean, that's going to be all ramped up as we really see World War III kick off. The one thing I've been wanting to say about the United States, and it's kind of, I mean, it's really related, but it was a thought like 20 minutes ago, some of the terrorism we've done to Cuba. A lot of people don't understand that we had a CIA agent, a Cuba dissident, and he actually blew up a Cuban airliner, and he killed the entire Cuban Olympic fencing team on board, 7 members of the Cuban Olympic fencing team, and scores of other innocent civilians. And then he got asylum in the United States, and he lived his days out, and we knew who he was. We knew what he did because he did it for us, and I shouldn't talk like that because he didn't do it for us. But this is the thing. This is the indoctrination coming out. We're indoctrinated into this liberalism that says this is our nation, and we gotta, a good patriot, defends what our nation does, right or wrong, or some nonsense. I mean, that's it. That's what they try and indoctrinate into us, that whatever we do is good because it's us doing it. In reality, of course, that's not true. There is objective good and bad. And what our nation is doing, again, is not for the American people. It's not for our country. It's for a class of transnational oligarchs who have, really been in charge of this country since its founding. They weren't transnational maybe at the founding. They were nationalists at the founding. But anyway, so the terrorism the United States has engaged in, against Cuba, unconscionable. Like we put biological warfare, administered biological warfare on that island. They had to slaughter their hog population. All the pigs on the island, they had to cull twice because we introduced biological warfare into their pigs just to make their lives miserable. In Indonesia, there's this book called the Jakarta Plan, I think, the Jakarta Plan. Our intelligence services, the CIA, facilitated the murder, the genocide of millions of Indonesian leftists. If you were a professor, if you were an organizer, a union leader, you would just be summarily executed. Millions of people given, this list was given to the people that were doing it, facilitated all by the CIA, by us, because, this is all part of the Cold War. Against communism, it's okay to do whatever. There's no morality. There's no legality. We're just gonna, further our interests. And if our interests are genocide, wow, we'll do it. what do we care?
Yeah, no, they don't care. They've never cared about human life. Human life matters nothing. And when I look at the whole history of the United States government and the way its military has been used, human life is nothing to them. Only maintaining their hegemony, only stealing those resources from others, and none of that is justified. And yeah, it is very sad. The prolific death and suffering for decades and currently is because of the biggest terrorist in the world, and that is the United States. And as you said, we can't use the word we and us. They like those terminologies to make people feel they have to be a part. Don't step outside of it, otherwise you're not a good American. But as you, I thought, very beautifully said, to be a patriot, however you want to say it, to be what you consider a good, quote, American, would be to oppose everything that your government is doing in the world. And because none of it is righteous, none of it is justified, none of it is self-defense. And that is the only way to look at it, and start using the word terrorist and start using the word murder. I think that many people, it matters. It matters. The actions need to be accurately described, not rationalized or softened in language. And it's imperative that people do that, at least for whatever good comes from your voice telling that truth, because you can't let their lying narrative replace the truth. You know the truth, go out and share it. And with that, I would make reference to that list. I invite everyone to historianoftruth.com. The terrorism essay is the first one on there, and at the end is an extensive list of all the terrorism that the United States is responsible for. And as you read that list, know that the result is millions of deaths. Unnecessary, unjustified. That's murder.
Please check that article out. And Christine joins me every other Friday, so I hope to have her back in 2 weeks' time with a new topic. I can't imagine what will happen in the next 2 weeks. Like, I mean, we could really just see a total global economic collapse. If Trump tries to do a land invasion, I mean, you'd think that would just immediately send the price of oil through the roof, even more than it already is. He's trying to manipulate the markets with his, with his words. But I just don't, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. But tune in next Tuesday and we'll talk more about it. Thank you so much, Christine.
Sure.
I'll see you then. Bye.